Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo!
And now, another exciting adventure in Tales from the Road. Back in the fall of 1968, I was living in the deserts of California up above Palm Springs at a place called 29 Palms. There are several stories as to how I ended up in 29 Palms, but there I was. Well, a friend of mine had moved back to New Jersey and New York, and I had always wanted to go to New York, and I had also always wanted to hitchhike around the country. It just was one of those things I knew I was going to do. So I thought this is as good a chance as any. Even though it was getting to be late in the year and rather cold, I decided to hitchhike to Princeton. No reason to let a few snowstorms get in the way of what you want to do. So as I started talking about hitchhiking and taking off, I started hearing all these stories about police and how, you know, when you're on the road and you got your backpack, and this is back when the hippies and the short-haired people were having their differences, and there was a lot of tension in the air at the time in '68. Apparently the police were the man, and they were hard on hitchhikers, and especially in Las Vegas, which I happened to be hitchhiking through in order to go from 29 Palms up to Boise. I wanted to go to Boise for Christmas and then head back east from there. So I was all prepared for the police being a hassle. On the other hand, I thought, well, you know, you have to deal with things as they come, not worry about them. So I gathered up my things, and it was a week or so before Christmas. I wrote out a sign, Boise for Christmas, and the people I was staying with took me up through Amboy and over to Highway 95, which heads north toward Las Vegas. So I was standing there on Highway 95 waiting to get a ride up to Highway 93, which actually goes by Las Vegas. And this old clunker of a car comes along. And it's just about the first car that came by. It was, you know, I didn't wait very long. And he pulls over and he offers me a ride. And as I get to riding, I notice that this car is not in the best shape. It's missing windshield wipers and several different things that I could pick up on. And I kind of mentioned that to the guy that was driving. He says, well, actually, that's my job, he says. He worked for the National Transportation Board or the National Highway System or the FBI, one of those people. So he was a cop, and his job was to drive around in this old clunker of a car, and he got to telling me all the things that were wrong with it. It didn't have license plates. It didn't have lights that worked. It didn't have a lot of stuff that cars have to have in order to be safe on our highways. So here I was, getting a ride from this guy, who's a cop, whose job is to go catch other cops. He was a real friendly guy. I enjoyed it. We had a nice time. Once we got to Las Vegas, and this is where the cops are really bad. You don't want to mess around with the cops in Las Vegas. Unless, of course, you have lots of money to spend, and that's what it's all about. Well, US 93, it kind of skirts the town off to the east of the main drag. I could see the city, I could see the main drag down, you know, in the distance. But I wanted to avoid confrontations, I wanted to avoid police, and I really wasn't there to do any gambling or anything. And so I just stayed on Highway 93. Now, of course, I'm sure it's all filled in with lots of houses, but at the time it was a kind of busy, wide major highway off pretty much going through the country. So I walked along, and I figured, well, they can't stop me if I'm not hitchhiking, so I just walked. And I was walking by, and I pretty well walked by all of Las Vegas. And I was just getting up to the north part where it curves over toward the north, and then it heads on up to Idaho. And I gotten into that curved part when all of a sudden a black and white police car with the lights drives by me and pulls into the street in front of me. So I figure, well, this is it. Who knows where I'll go from here? So I walked up to the corner of the street, and sure enough, they had pulled around and they'd come back, and they were kind of waiting for me. And so I just kind of walked along, and they got out of their car, and I stopped. And they came over and they acknowledged me, and I acknowledged them, and we chatted, and they said, well, so you headed into Boise for Christmas? And I said, yes. And they said, well, don't you have enough money? And I said, well, I probably have enough money to catch a bus from Las Vegas, but, you know, I'd really kind of like to save it for Christmas presents. And we chatted. I assume they took my license and called it in. I don't really remember that, but I assume they did. It's their job after all. And so at some point they gave me back my license, and you know, I was picking up my bag and everything that I was hitchhiking with, and they says, well, you know, good luck. Hope you make it to Boise okay. Hope things work out. And they were going back to their car, and I was starting to walk on down the road when I heard the driver, the main policeman who had been doing most of the talking, call out to me. He says, hey. And I turned to him, and he says, yeah. He says, here, you can probably use this more than I can. And he threw me a candy bar, one of these great big old honkers of a candy bar that he had in his car. It wasn't a regular sized candy bar. It was a huge candy bar. So that was my experience with those mean, nasty cops in Las Vegas. Once I got back east, I did go back east by train. They were having one of the biggest winter ice storms all through the Midwest. It was a beautiful trip by train. The sun was coming out through all this ice all through the Midwest. This ice was hanging on the trees. Absolutely gorgeous. It was really beautiful. As long as you're inside a nice warm train. Believe me, I was glad I was not on the road. Partly because the roads were closed. The highways were closed. The airports were closed. The only things moving were trains. So I got to Chicago expecting to just transfer and go on into New York. However, it was such a madhouse in Chicago. That train station probably had not been that busy in years and years and years. And all the trains were full. And the only way to catch a train was just to go stand in line. There's the train to New York, go stand in line. When it gets full, you can't get on anymore. So I did. And I finally made it to New York. I lived outside of New York in the hills around Princeton for a while. And that spring, when it was quite cool out still, it was April, I think, and it was still rainy and damp, I started hitchhiking again. And I hitchhiked toward the northwest. I wanted to see Cape Cod. I wanted to see Maine. I didn't really have anywhere I was going. I really avoided big roads. My object was to find the teeniest little black lines on maps that I could find and head out that way. And I found a lot of great, beautiful back countryside. I didn't worry about much. Just meandering along the road. I really didn't even stick out my thumb. I just walked, and people would stop and offer me a ride because I obviously was a stranger walking through. Well, I had gotten up State Highway 55 in New York. I was going from Berryville, right on the Pennsylvania border, where I had passed into New York, up to Liberty. And from Liberty, I was going to go on through the Catskill Mountains. As I was approaching Liberty, I was coming up the road came to a hillside. And the road clumb up this hillside just outside of Liberty, just maybe 4 miles outside of Liberty, if even that, maybe a mile outside of Liberty. And it went up this hillside. Well, as it was going up the hillside, it was very narrow. It was a 2-lane road, but just barely. It was a state highway, but it was very, very narrow and very dangerous and very, you couldn't you couldn't really see up it until you had turned into it because of the forests. So here I was walking on this very narrow little stretch of road. It wasn't very long, but it just had to be gone up. So I was walking along this narrow bit of road, kind of dragging my feet over in the gutter as much as I could, actually, thinking that I'll be glad when I get past this. When a car came from the top of the hill and started coming down, and lo and behold, it was a police car. So I thought, well, I'd be surprised if he wants to stop on this narrow little road. But sure enough, he did. He pulled over and he got out and he had me come over, and I was talking with him. And I don't remember his even checking my ID. He just kind of was asking what I was doing and where I was going. And he expressed to me, well, you know, my real concern is this is such a narrow little bit of a road. And I said, well, I agree with you, officer. That's why I was just walking to get past it. And I agree, it's not a good place to be hitchhiking, and I didn't intend to hitchhike, but, you know, I've got to get past this little stretch of road. So just about the time, you know, he got comfortable with what's going on and that I knew what was going on and I wasn't being stupid and trying to hitchhike in a dangerous place. And with that, he says, so what do you have in your box there? Well, one of the things I was traveling with was my oils. This is the very box right here. And I had been walking around carrying my box and a very, very heavy pack. I was not a smart hitchhiker, but I had a certain panache, you know? So I says, oh, well, these are my oils because I do some painting. And he says, how do you thin out your paint? It comes out of the tube so thick. And I says, well, that's what you have linseed oil for. And I started to put the box down. I kind of says, oh, I don't want to scratch your car. He says, don't worry about it. So I put the box down and I unsnapped the snaps. I guess I put it this way. And I unsnapped the snaps and I opened it up and I took out the linseed oil. And I says, you know, if you just put a few drops of this, it doesn't take much. It'll thin it right out. And of course, you can put quite a lot on and really absorb into the canvas if you want. Well, once we were having that discussion, I wasn't too worried about going to jail. The police officer said, well, thanks, I'll try that out. Linseed oil, huh? And with that, he says, you know, well, good luck and get off this bit of road. And he said, you know, I'd give you a ride on into Liberty if I were going that way. So he apologized for not giving me a ride. Of all my time on the road, I ran into those three police. And I can't really say I had a real negative experience with the man when I was out hitchhiking during 1968, 69, 70, and 71. Oh my goodness, folks. It is warming up and I am ready. This coming Saturday is actually the first day of spring, the spring equinox. Since I can't say it any better than that beer drinking guide already has, I have dug up last year's tribute to the spring equinox and will be showing it today. There will, of course, be a few places where we bring you up-to-date information. So hang on to your seats. Here is my tribute to the spring equinox.
And, of course, to all of the flowers, warm weather, storms, and other delights that spring equinox implies. This year, the moment of actual equinox happened on Friday, March 20th at 5:45 in the morning. Last December, at the time of the solstice, the sun was directly over the Tropic of Capricorn. If you had been standing there with a big sombrero, you would have had a shadow cast directly down to your feet. Since then, the Earth has traveled 1/4 of the way around the sun. That means that because the Earth is tilted on its axis, as of Friday, March 20th at 5:45 in the morning, the Earth was directly where the sun is over the equator. And if you'd been at the equator with your big sombrero on, your shadow from the sombrero would have been cast directly down to your feet. The equinoxes, both in the spring and in the fall, are when the days are exactly 12 hours long and the nights are 12 hours long. It comes from a Latin word, a Latin combination of words, that means equal night. So here we are on our beautiful blue planet, traveling around the sun, having gone past the spring or vernal equinox. Over the last year, we have looked at the going into new seasons from the perspective of the ancient Egyptian religions. The goddess of summer, Isis, was the goddess of growth and absorbing the light. The goddess Hathor for autumn is the goddess of gathering in the harvest and of enjoying the beautiful evening of the day, the time of relaxation and comfort. Last December, we looked at the god Osiris, the god of winter. He is the god of death and the god of the earth and the underground. Just as, indeed, all of life does go underground, it becomes winter and things settle down. In coming to understand the ancient understandings of religion, we have to remember that the gods are not separated from life. Rather, the gods are expressions of the different seasons. The word Osiris was the word for winter, just as the word Isis was the word summer. Now, in the spring, we enter the time of life, the time of the year, that is represented by the falcon. The word falcon literally was Horus. Actually, that's a Greek interpretation of the Egyptian. It's the word that we have today. References to Horus go back well over 5,000 years. Such an important god, of course, had many myths and many stories connected to him. There were some that I would have a little trouble putting into polite enough language to be telling here on a public broadcast. But there are others that are equally as interesting. Basically, it was accepted that Horus was the child of Osiris and Lady Isis. Lady Isis, you'll remember, is the goddess of the summer, the goddess of gathering in the sunlight, of gathering in the energy for life. Osiris, of course, is the god of death and the underworld. So a child born of the two great aspects of life, the gathering in the energy and the rest of winter, obviously would be quite a child. And, of course, spring is a huge influence in life. To understand one of the very major stories of Horus, we have to know a little bit about ancient Egypt. Today, we think of Egypt as a big square box with a river running up the east side. The ancients did not see Egypt that way. The ancients saw Egypt as this. Egypt was the Nile River. It was called a lotus flower, which of course you can see why they would say that. The delta at the northern end of it makes it appear as a lotus when you pull back and look at it. As civilization began to creep into human history 10,000 years ago or so, there were two Egypts. There was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Today, we may think that the Delta region is Upper Egypt because it's to the north, but that is not how the Egyptians saw it. The Lower Egypt, of course, is the downriver part of Egypt. Upper Egypt is the upriver part of Egypt. Literally, the change happens at about where Cairo is, just about where the delta opens up. As civilization developed on the Nile River, these were two separate lands, two separate kingdoms, two separate ways of seeing themselves. About 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years before the current era, these two separate lands were united into one land. Upper Egypt got the better hand and consolidated the entire Nile Valley into what was called Egypt. It was about this time they started building the Great Pyramids. One of the great stories of Horus was the story of uniting the Egyptian kingdom. Horus was the god of Upper Egypt. Isis, Horus's mother, had a brother. His name was Set. Set, it turns out, was the god of Upper Egypt. So the story of the battle between Horus and Set became the story of uniting Egypt and one of the kingdoms becoming dominant over the other. Set murdered Osiris, Horus's father, so there was some bad blood between them. Because Horus is a hawk or a falcon, Horus is represented by the sky. Included in that representation are the sun and the moon. In one of the many battles between Horus and Set, Set ripped out the left eye of Horus, the moon. His left eye was restored, but never to its full capacity. And that is why the moon is not as bright as the sun. And it is why the moon goes through phases. One of the parts of living in ancient Egypt was understanding that when the moon was new and not shining, Horus was blinded to the world. He did not have his left eye overlooking the world and protecting us. It was at this time that Horus was also considered dangerous. After all, he could not see if you were a friend or a foe, and he might lash out, not meaning to. Isis, the goddess of summer and the mother of Horus, gave to Horus the job of protecting the people from Set. Set was the god of the desert, storms, and chaos. So Isis saw where there was a need to protect the people from such influences. During one of their many battles, just as Horus had lost an eye, so it was that Set lost a testicle, and that is why deserts are barren. Eventually, the gods got tired of the warring between Set and Horus. They sat down and listened to arguments, some of which were rather risque, and they decided that Horus was the victor in this ancient bout, and the nation became united under the Upper Empire. Throughout Egypt, and indeed many places in the ancient world, Horus is recognized as a great and influential god. And who, after all, would want to celebrate life without celebrating spring? And just why would a hawk or a falcon represent spring? Well, when a hawk or a falcon fly, they do not need to flap their wings. They can just hold their wings out and the air will lift them up into the sky. Of course, to the uneducated and the superstitious, the ancients would have looked at this and said, look, it's levitation. These creatures just go into the sky, they belong there. The scientists and the learned people, of course, understood that there were wind gusts blowing up from hills, and the eagles and the hawks were using those to ride the air. However, whether it's understood scientifically or superstitiously, the bottom line is that hawks, falcons, and eagles have always been understood to be symbols of how life rises up, how life ascends effortlessly into the heavens. Just as the dung beetle gave us the concept of life resurrecting itself out of nothing, so it is that the hawk, Horus, the god of spring, the god that is every male of every species, Horus represents life ascending effortlessly. And just as we, in springtime, recognize the resurrection of life in what we call the celebration of Easter, so the ancients understood in springtime the resurrection of the glory of Horus, the glory of life.
Today's music appreciation question is, why do bagpipers always walk while they are playing the bagpipes? The correct answer is to get away from the noise. And that's this week's Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo! Enjoy the equinox on Saturday. Springtime will be here. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next time. And in the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo!